This is Debrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to Debrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and policy to industry. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group, and I'm joined today by CEO of Standards Australia, Rod Balding. Welcome, Rod.
Hi, Louise. Thanks for having me.
Australian Industry Group is a founding member of Standards Australia, which is over 100 years old. And we're also the largest nominating organisation, which means we nominate members to represent us on standards committees from washing machines to quantum. And a bit over a year ago, I was elected onto the board. So our relationship with Standards Australia is broad and deep and absolutely essential for our members. Rod, people probably have a very narrow view of standards depending on how they've encountered them. But what's the first moment in your career when a standard stopped being just about paperwork and became a real-world safety net for you?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. And look, as you mentioned, we're over 100 years old. And for over that 100 years, we've actually been the backbone of safety in this country. Whether it's the roads you drive on every day, the bridges you cross, the houses you live in, or even the toys you give your children, standards actually sit behind that safety, quality, and consistency that we've come to expect and sort of rely on as Australians. I've been in the role for just over a year now, and there's probably been a couple of things that have really jumped out at me where I went, oh my goodness, like this is real, and look at the impact that we're having. The most recent one is probably when I got to have a chat with the Wiggles on button batteries, and obviously something that's quite innocuous can actually have quite serious medical issues on toddlers if standards weren't there to protect them around packaging. But the thing that probably jumps out at me the most was in my very first week, I joined a town hall, and part of the town hall, we do a spotlight on sort of some of the work that we're doing as an organisation. And I went home that night in my first week and I said to my wife and family, I now work at an organisation where I learnt that we are working with the Pacific on Carver, the Queensland government on critical and emerging tech, including flow batteries, and we're working with farmers on red seaweed called Asparagopsis to put into food to help with climate change and sustainability. And I think it was that moment that I just went, wow, it is so broad, the impact that standards have on everyone's lives every day.
And as you say, it's not just about safety, but also helping communities to build markets, such as the Carver story in the Pacific.
Yeah, definitely. And look, we obviously are a proud national standards body and we participate on the global stage as well. But we're also very, very passionate about helping our Pacific neighbours and developing countries understand the importance of standardisation and the benefits of standardisation for the resilience of their economy as well.
Now, there's some sort of very hardline economic rationalists who probably think that standards are sort of speed bumps or hidden, the hidden grease and sort of the gears. What's the reality? What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about standards?
Look, I think there's probably a couple of things that we need to try and help probably educate the narrative on a little bit better. The first one, as you said, the people that are aware of standards and use them or model standards, there are a lot of people that do see us as a bit of a speed bump, as a hindrance. I think where we need to try and address that is the education and the awareness of the impact of standards. So I think it's incumbent on us as a national standards body to really tell those stories to say, how do we actually make those standards real and the benefits of those standards real? But then secondly, I think there's something about how we actually translate those incredibly important documents that thousands of experts give up their time to create into things that are much more usable for the people who have to use the end standards in their day-to-day jobs. So rather than seeing a deep technical document as a compliance cost or a burden or, as you said, a potential hindrance or speed bump, what can we do as an organisation to break down that technical information and those specifications and make it much more user-friendly for those end users?
Now, you don't get to be 100 years old without, constantly reevaluating yourself and how you do things and making sure you constantly remain relevant. So recently you conducted an end-to-end review on how you actually, or how we make standards. So that pointed to a shift from just the administrative support from Standards Australia to a much more active and end-to-end stewardship. So what does success look like in practice when that shift is working?
Yeah, so you're right, Louise. We went through a very comprehensive independent review, and it was deliberately independent because we didn't want to mark our own homework. We know that to be successful, not just now, but in the future, we needed to have a look at how we were conducting the standards development process, and really importantly, how we were structured and what level and consistency of support we were putting around our really important volunteers. The key recommendation, as you said, was moving away from admin support and more to stewardship. And when we step back and say, what is success going to look like in that model? There's a number of different lenses that we want to look through. I think the first one is we want to make sure that standards are a living asset. They're not a set and forget. We want to make sure that Standards Australia, combined with industry, combined with experts, are continuing to reevaluate what is fit for purpose. They need to be living documents because the world we're living in is changing rapidly, and we need to make sure that those standards are fit for purpose in today's world as well. The other lens we want to look at is we want to make sure that we are addressing issues up front. So I think under this model, we want to make sure that we're being a lot more proactive on contentious issues in standards development early. Rather than wait until ballot or public comment to understand what are some of the challenges or concerns from industry or the public, we want to be on the front foot with this. We want to be talking about that at the constitution of a standards committee. Before we actually start the drafting, let's actually see what those issues are. Let's work through those issues early, and then let's draft the standard then, rather than trying to address those issues through the drafting process and then potentially waiting for comments at the end. And then I think the final one is making sure that we are actually a little bit quicker in what we do. So it's a very robust process. It needs to be a very robust process because of the quality of output that's required. But I do think that under this review and when we implement the recommendations, there's a very, very strong opportunity for us to be more efficient, be a little bit more agile, and be able to put standards out more quickly than we are at the moment.
And as you say, these committees are primarily made up of volunteers, and there are members we put forward and other associations put forward to volunteer. So for those listening, what's the one hard metric or the one human feel signal you'd expect these committee members to notice first?
So the hard metric is going to be tackling those issues earlier. And so we want to make sure that there are good, robust, open, transparent conversations where everyone feels comfortable putting their views on the table at the commencement of a project. And I think that's really, really important. In terms of the human feel signal, I'd love people to say that Standards Australia have become easier to work with. So whether that is through the efficiency of the process, whether that's through the consistency and enhanced quality of support we're putting around our experts, I want people to feel that we are an easier organisation to work with through that standards development process than perhaps we have been in the past.
Now, people listening, if they're not involved in standards development, might be a little shocked to discover that it can get quite heated in these meetings, as people are very passionate about their industries and what they see is right. So what surprised you most in the review findings about how committees work day to day, but especially, and as you've alluded to, behaviour conflicts and the people dynamics that decides whether a standard moves or stalls?
Yeah, so there's probably a few things that have come out of the review and sort of come out from being in this chair and seeing how standards development process works. I think as part of the review, one of the main things that jumped out at me was the passion that people have for standards and standards development. So we have a lot of people that care deeply about what we collectively do. And look, that's sort of shown by the number of volunteers that we have, obviously many from AI Group, which we're incredibly grateful for, but also the number of people that were willing to give up their time through attending the feedback forums for the review, sitting in on focus groups, or even writing submissions in as part of the review as well. So that passion was there, and there is a clear population of people that care deeply about what we do and how we do it. But as you said, that passion can sometimes lead to some challenging conversations when you get around a table which people actually talk about a topic which they're deep experts in and have very, very firm views on. And so what did surprise me to a degree was obviously how dependent those people dynamics are in the standard development process as opposed to just the technical content. I think sometimes when people think about standards, they think about there's a bunch of people in the room and they're arguing purely technical positions. And whilst that does take place and the technical debate is incredibly important, the people dynamic is really where the committees work well or not. And so it showed to me that that people dynamic needs to be very, very clearly chaired from a committee chair perspective, but also supported from a Standards Australia perspective as well. We need to help people have a lot of clarity on their role. We need to make sure that if we can see a little bit of tension bubbling up the committee, how do we address that early? And we need to make sure that we're being consistent in sort of how we provide that level of support and ensuring the right level of behaviour of all our committee members across all our committees as well.
And I think also in that framework, nominating organisations have to step up because, that these are people representing us, using our name, and we, if we get an inkling that behaviour is not collaborative and contributing positively, then we also have a responsibility to step up. But I think when every organisation is, and government department is all looking for engagement, having that base of passion is a luxury I think Standards Australia should be proud of.
I could not agree more. Well, I call our volunteers the engine room of Standards Australia. Without our volunteers, we don't exist. And you're right. I think that passion, that expertise, that willingness of people to bring their IP to the table, to develop a standard that's in the national interest of Australia and often the global interest when they participate in sort of ISO and IEC committees, that is an incredibly privileged position that we're in as an organisation. And to be honest, it's one of the reasons why we undertook this review, because we know that with that privilege, we need to be reciprocal in the level of quality that we're providing as well.
Now, I have warned members, even if there's change that people want, doesn't necessarily mean change is easy. And so I've told them to, keep with the journey, but there will be a trade-off, really, won't there, in terms of speed, inclusivity and technical rigour. You can't maximise everything all at once. So how do you decide what to protect and what to redesign?
So the underlying principle when we're looking to implement the review recommendations, and look, there were 9 core recommendations. Of those 9 core recommendations, we have over 60 detailed actions that we're implementing. That will be a 3-year journey. As you said, we can't do everything at once, and we need to make sure we're doing it in a very careful and considered way. The 2 underlying principles that we're sort of like making sure we abide to as we look to put these changes in place is 1, we cannot compromise the quality of what we output. So we can't compromise the quality, the robustness, and the actual safety that comes with the development of standards. That has to be non-negotiable. The other thing that I said we need to be incredibly focused on and committed to is very clear and open 2-way communication with our members, our non-orgs, and our contributors. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't focus on things like speed and inclusivity, but it can't come at the cost of those 2 things. So for speed example, as I mentioned before, we need to find ways to do things a little bit more efficiently. That's both through the implementation of this review, but also through the standard development process. And through inclusivity as well, we want to make sure that all appropriate voices are sitting around that table when we constitute a committee, and we can't take shortcuts. So we need to make sure that we are considering who are those stakeholders, who are the nominating organisations that should be represented, and are we getting the right people with the right skill set to have that good, robust debate in developing a standard.
Thanks, Rod. So we'll just pause for a break and we'll come back and talk about how standards are fitting into the international framework.
You're listening to the Debrief podcast, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group. To find out more about how Australian Industry Group can help your business, visit australianindustry.group.com.au.
And welcome back to Debrief. We're talking to Rod Balding, CEO of Standards Australia, about the standards end-to-end review, but also how it fits into the international framework. So on international alignment, and you talked about how Australian participants do contribute to ISO and IEC. So how does that harmonisation and mutual recognition genuinely cut trade friction? And where do Australian conditions still justify a local carve-out?
So another thing that I have been surprised about is the impact we have on the global stage. And when I've taken on this role and I've been fortunate enough to meet my counterparts in other national standards bodies or talk to executives or board members at ISO IEC, they are very, very keen to compliment Australia on the work that our volunteers and our experts do, and we definitely punch above our weight on the global stage. When it comes to what that means, first and foremost, when we're developing a standard, we need to look at, is there an international standard that we should be adopting locally? And that's required for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's required under our WTO obligations. But secondly, as you mentioned, there's an opportunity there to really make sure that we're acting in the best interest of Australia from a trade perspective. We're opening up global markets for both imports and exports, and we're making the lives of sort of like manufacturers and industry easier because they need to comply with one standard and ideally one set of compliance rules and regulation. But, and it's a big but, we have to make sure that we aren't just blindly adopting those international standards if there is a requirement for a local carve-out. And so where this comes to things like climate, Australia is a very, very different climate to Europe. So when you're looking at things like bushfires, cyclones, UV rays, what that means for standards in Australia does not mean it will be the same as an international standard that may have been driven by someone who is sitting in a European country or a Northern American country. So we always need to think, is there an appropriate international standard to begin with? But we also then need to make sure that if there is a very, very strong and legitimate argument for us to have a local carve-out, we do that. A couple of good examples is one, if you look at the electrical plugs. So when you jump on a plane, we all have to take those wonderful adapters and you need to plug it into, you jump off the plane in another country and you have to plug in the adapter so you can plug in your computer or your mobile phone or your hairdryer, whatever it is. That comes about because we didn't have an international standard for electricity. We should, but we don't. If I compare that to Wi-Fi, the reason we can get off a plane and connect to a Wi-Fi network anywhere in the world without an adapter is because the CSIRO did an amazing job of developing Wi-Fi and everyone picked it up under a global standard. So there's two examples as to why the importance of international standard adoption helps everyday consumers, but also some of the challenges if we don't have a legitimate reason for carve-out causes a little bit more burden on people as well.
And I think regular listeners will be screaming at the listening device when you're going to say New Zealand, Louise, because it's a bugbear of mine. So I'll just take a moment to congratulate you and the team for a very pragmatic, practical agreement with Standards New Zealand, because there was a risk that it was dejointing, but I think that the agreement now that's been announced, I think is a really positive way forward.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And we know how many businesses operate Trans-Tasman. I heard very loud and clear when I started the importance of working closely with Standards New Zealand. There was a lot of great work that was done before I started in terms of looking to try and bring both those organisations back together. I'm very fortunate with the team that I've got, but I was also very fortunate with Malcolm McMillan and his team at Standards New Zealand, where they were also equally keen to bring the organisations back together for the betterment of both Australian and New Zealand business. So, look, it's a great step forward. It was a really important step forward that we needed to take, but we did so by working very closely together. And it's great to see us rebuild that relationship and work on a lot of Australian New Zealand projects going forward.
Yeah, no, it's great. But we are in a period of real geopolitical competition, and standards themselves almost become an instrument of power. So how do you see that playing out in critical industries, and what does good stewardship look like in that environment?
It is definitely becoming a more strategic tool that countries are using. And even in the 12 months that I've been here, it's probably moved from a very subtle to a not so subtle tool that countries are using in their sort of like economic resilience and consideration of what standards should look like. What we need to do as a country, and again, coming back to the fact that we want to adopt international standards where possible, is we need to make sure we have a seat at the table, particularly in those critical and emerging industries. So something like quantum, something like moving from 5G to 6G, things around cyber and AI, we need to make sure that we have the right experts from Australia sitting at those global tables helping develop and influence the standards that are going to be in the best interests of not just the world, but in the best interest of our national economy and our national security as well. We're really lucky that we've got some great people that sit at those tables. For example, Quantum, the chair of our local Quantum committee is Dr. Kathy Foley, the former chief scientist of Australia. She's amazing. She sits at those tables and she represents us incredibly well. But we also want to make sure that we're helping our Pacific countries when it comes to this as well. So whilst we sit at that global table and we help influence international standards on those critical and emerging technologies, we also want to make sure that our Pacific neighbours aren't getting left behind when things are being implemented. So if you look at things like cyber, so as the Pacific countries adopt more and more of this emerging technology, whether it's through AI or whether it's through chatbots or even increasing use of social media through some of those developing countries, they don't necessarily always have the awareness or the education of the risks that come with them. And so we want to make sure that we're taking our experience from that global table, our experience from the local adoption, and helping educate and increase the awareness of how to do that responsibly, how to do that safely, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't sort of compromise your privacy, your personal data, or put you at financial risk as well.
And as a number of major economies push competing standards in areas like energy systems or digital tech, as you say, cyber, other critical materials, how does Australia decide when to align, when to assert, and when to stay pragmatic?
So first and foremost, we always need to act in the best interest of Australia. So everyone who is there representing Australia at those global tables or considering an adoption of an international standard here locally has a what is in the net benefit of Australia sort of value that they need to uphold. As an organisation, we rely, as I said, on some amazing experts to make the judgment call on that. That there'll be some times where they need to assert themselves quite strongly into a conversation. There'll be some times where they can be a little bit more subtle and sort of that the way the standard is being developed is sort of in accordance with what we'd like to see as a country. And then there is sometimes where we may decide that we need our own local standard for whether it's national security, sovereignty, or climate-related issues that we've talked about before. But at the end of the day, it's the judgment of those experts that we rely on and we're incredibly grateful for, combined with obviously their strong engagement and international perspective that helps us decide when we need to lean in a little bit more heavily or when we can look to be a little bit more, not backseat, but influential in a subtle way.
Well, thanks very much, Rod. Clearly, Standards Australia will have an important role in supporting industry and Australia's strategic interests as we embark in this multipolar world. If you're a member of Australian Industry Group and you'd like to get more involved in standards development for your industry, please email industry.policy@australianindustrygroup.com.au or find James Thompson on LinkedIn. You'll see he has regular stories on our impact in standards development. If you found this podcast via link or our website, please do subscribe on your usual podcast platform and even leave in a review. It helps people to find us. And we'll speak in a couple of weeks. Thanks.